Hello, my name is Margot Kelley, and I want to thank you for being interested in reading my book, A Gardiner at the End of the World, as part of the Read Maine program this summer. I was thrilled that it was selected as the nonfiction choice, and I hope that you enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed writing it. For the libraries who are involved with this program, they've asked the authors if we could each share with you our answers to a few questions. And so that's what I'm going to do in the rest of this video. The first question is, what are 3 things that we want people to be thinking about or knowing about when they read our books? For me, one of the first things that I realized is that authors told me that the book jumped around a little bit in the narrative and it took some getting used to. I want to reassure you that that's on purpose, and I want you to try and have the chance to think about why does it do it and what does it gain from having that little bit of choppiness to it. Something that I was thinking about quite a bit when I was working on the book was the difference between experiencing the pandemic in a rural state like Maine versus experiencing it in a city. A lot of the early imagery that we got about the pandemic was city focused. And my experience felt really different from that of people who were living in an urban space. For example, I had the chance to be outside every day, and I didn't have to be afraid when I was outside. So one of the things I would encourage you to think about is how your experience of the pandemic compared or differed from the experience that I write about in the book. A third thing that is worth mentioning is that I had a lot of binaries in mind when I was working on this project. They were things like the tension between individualism and interconnectedness, or between the need to stay put or the desire to be mobile. This mattered for plants, for humans, even for bacteria and germs. I would encourage my readers to think about what are some of the other binaries that they noticed operating in the work, and how did those binaries help? How did they make the reading a little bit more complicated and a little bit more nuanced? Another question that they wanted us to answer is what we had to leave out when we were writing the book. And in my case, the answer is so much stuff. As you probably already know, the book is a braid, and it combines the story of me in my garden for a year, the story of the COVID pandemic in that first year, 2020, and the story of several historical pandemics, and the story of how the plants that we rely on, the plants that are in my garden now, all came to be food plants, because of course they didn't start out initially as plants that were intended for human consumption. So when I had all of that material, I had to leave out a ton of interesting stories, tons of details about other pandemics, plenty of details about our own pandemic. I left out a lot of my frustrations with the government and the government's response to it. I left out some of the details about the garden and the days that it was just not exciting for me to be out in the garden where it wasn't offering sustenance. So all of those things did get left out. But what I think as I reflect back on the book is that leaving those out changed some of the nuances here and there, but they didn't change the overall story. They didn't change the trajectory of what I was trying to get at in this book. Didn't change the main set of concerns that I was exploring, the central one of which is how humans and other co-evolutionary partners all evolved together on this crazy journey, and how we share space in our inevitably overlapping lives. The third question that they asked is, why did we write the book and why did we do it now? And of course, in my case, the short answer is COVID. I had been getting ready to write a book about contemporary seed saving when the pandemic started. And I knew that if I couldn't travel to meet new people who were seed savers, and I couldn't travel to places where seed saving libraries were, I wasn't going to be able to do that project well. And so, pandemic word, I pivoted. And quite early during the pandemic, probably in April of 2020, I started reading a bunch of articles that compared COVID to the Spanish flu, which was about 100 years earlier, was at the peak of when the Spanish flu was taking place all over the world, not, by the way, just in Spain. And that made me curious to learn more about how humans managed during other pandemics. In other pandemics, we didn't have antibiotics. In other pandemics, We didn't have a globalized healthcare system. In other pandemics, most of the time, we didn't even have germ theory. So people were coming to the task of surviving pandemics with far fewer resources than we had, and yet they did. Pandemic after pandemic, a significant portion of the human population survived, and that's why we're here now. And so in those pandemics and in how people responded to them, I thought there might be some stories of hope. And that's what I went really looking for. It wasn't that I wanted to compare the gruesomeness of our own moment with the gruesomeness of theirs. It was that I wanted to understand better how people rallied, how they made the decisions to work together, to protect each other, and how they thrived in the wake of those pandemics. How I wrote the book, I can't explain quite as clearly. I don't know exactly how it was that I came to think that, oh, I'll compare this garden and food story with this pandemic story. I do know that one of the factors that was involved was discovering that pandemics didn't take place in human populations until we became agriculturalists. And so there was some important link between us growing food and us having pandemics. But that link could have easily soured me on working on a book that explored how they connected to each other, and it didn't. Instead, I found the process really invigorating and vitalizing, because one of the things it forced me to do was to think hard about how we are connected to germs, as well as how we're connected to plants and animals in the larger than human world. And then the last question that they asked us to answer is, if you read this book and you really liked it, what other books can I recommend? So if you liked the mix of natural history and the present day story, then there's a book by another Maine author that you really might enjoy. It's by Alix Morris, and it's called A Year with Seals. It came out last summer. Similarly, Laura Popick wrote a book that came out in 2025 called Strata. That's an exploration of geology and what studying geology can help us to know about our current circumstances, and maybe ways that it can point toward good future choices as we face climate change and climate disruption. On the other hand, if the thing that you really loved was learning about pandemics and how they changed the trajectory of human history, then I would wholeheartedly recommend a book called Pathogenesis, A History of the World in 8 Plagues. This one is by Jonathan Kennedy, who's not a Mainer, and yet he wrote a great, great book that we can all enjoy. And then if it was the part about the gardens that really got you jazzed, then there are many, many potential books to turn to next. A Maine Garden Almanac by Martha Fenn King is a beautiful option, as is Native Plants for Your Maine Garden by Maureen Heffernan, who was part of the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens. And so those are the questions that they were hoping that we would answer to get you started on your journey with our books. I hope that they're useful to you, and I hope that you love the book. And if you ever want to reach out, you can reach me through my website, which is margotannekelley.com, or you can reach out through your library. Again, thank you so much. Happy reading.